Hello and welcome to your next session, which looks at interactionism and youth culture. Obviously, this is another theory from the youth culture section. So far, if you've gone through the series, you will have looked at postmodernism, functionalism, Marxism, feminism, and now we look at interactionism, which is a little bit different, and there is a reason why we will leave it to the end. Out of the five, you should know already, have a good idea why it is the strangest one. So, first thing that I want you to do, before we even look at the page, is I want you to think about the answer to this question. What would the repercussions be for an arrest for a serious crime, for example, drug dealing or violence? What would happen to you if you were arrested, charged, maybe even, given a court date for a very, very serious crime? We're not talking about, speeding here. We're talking about, a real big one. What you need to do when you're considering this is to think outside of the box, okay? Is to make sure you don't go with just the obvious, but obviously the obvious will work. But on top of that, what other potential repercussions could there be? So pause now. Fill it in just around this image. 4, 5, 6 things that you could think of. Off you go. Right then, folks. We'll go with the obvious. Prison. A run-in with the police. So restriction of your freedoms by these people, these agents of social control, but also geographically you might be restricted and moved to a location where your freedom is taken from you. Your ability to move around as freely as you want has gone. You've been placed under those restrictions. These are the most obvious ones, but remember, there are additional ones that would go with this. You might have put that you have a criminal record. Now, remember, a criminal record will affect your job. It will affect university. People have to declare these when you're going into an interview, when you're applying for a job, when you're applying for a university place. So this could potentially lead you to not getting those opportunities that you'll need. On top of that, you might think about this idea of being socially isolated. Think about your relationships with your family. Think about your relationships with your friends. They might change irreparably in some cases because you might get given a label. And this label can have a very, very significant effect. So if we look at these simple, yes, you might end up in prison. Yeah, you might deal with the police. You might end up in the court system. But you have a permanent record that goes with you. And on top of that, you also kind of carry a record of it, but it's not written down. You carry with you a kind of label, a stigma is a good word for it. You carry this with you, which will affect your friends, your family. It will affect how people interact with you. Now, obviously, we are talking about interactionism today. And the clue is in the title. Interactions, you can see there. Now, interactionism is going to be different fundamentally to the other theories. And if you look at the top of the page, it will tell you the interactionist approach is based on small-scale interactions. This type of study is known as micro. It is looking at the small scale, the me to you interaction. It's not macro, it's not a functionalism or a Marxism or a feminism that generally looks at the top down of society. It's looking at the small. And obviously, and micro is your missing word, this approach is sometimes known as a social action theory. And you can see the word action in there. Because action means that my individual here, there's my happy man, he's active in shaping the world around him. So he is the one who shapes society. Remember, the opposite to a social action theory is a structural theory, like functionalism or Marxism or feminism, where the individual is shaped by that society. And in that case, they are passive little slugs. You're a passive, just a recipient of all your socialisation. You come out looking all the same at the other end. This is not a structural approach. This is a social action theory. You are active in shaping the world through the labels that you give, the interactions that you have, the uniqueness of those, the uniqueness of your perspective and how you view things, how you act towards people and how they act towards you. You are active in that process. That's the big thing about interactionism. Now, we know from within interactionism, and you should be familiar with this fella, is Howard Becker. Now, Howard Becker is a very, very important figure within the interactionist theory, and Howard Becker is known for his work on labelling theory. And within his book, which is called Outsiders, I'll talk to you about that in just a second, he very famously gives this quote: deviant behaviour is behaviour that people so label. It is 8 words, but those 8 words are very, very significant. What I would like you to do is pause the video now and tell me what you think that means. And pop your suggestions in the box on the bottom of page number 1. Deviant behaviour is behaviour that people so label. What do you think this means? Again, think outside the box on this one. I don't want you to just go for the obvious, though the obvious is good. I want you to, pay real attention to what those words could mean and what that will tell us about labelling theory. Deviant behaviour is behaviour people so label. Pause it now and start to fill that box in, and we'll feed back in a second. Okay, for deviant behaviour is behaviour people so label. I'm hoping the first thing that you might get is that deviant behaviour is kind of labelled by society, which means that in many ways society tells you what is deviant and what isn't deviant, and therefore we can deduce that deviance is a social construct. It is something which is made by the society around it. It will vary from time to time and place to place, which will also tell us deviance is relative. You know that what is criminal in America, drinking when you're 20 in some states, because it's got to be 21 in America, that's not going to be illegal here because you can drink when you're 18. Thus that deviance is made by the society. We have a different code. And it's relative because it's going to vary. If you're in America, it's a different set of laws and regulations and norms and values to over here. So just like norms and values, deviance is relative. Also, people might have said that the label will affect you. The label will affect your behaviour, absolutely. And there are lots of negative labels, which is absolutely true. So you might have put that idea down. There is one further idea that I like to talk about from this, and it is the use of the word behaviour. Now, when you think this is a behaviour, what you actually think is this is an act. If you say this person exhibits bad behaviour, they have to do something. They are doing something in order to warrant that response from you. And what they are doing is an act. For Becker, it all starts with an act. You have to have done an act for this deviance. Not just what's in your head, it's not thought, it's action. It starts with an act. So let's say, just for argument's sake, I don't know what you can see, but I'm going to take this pen off here. Magnetic. Didn't think that was going to happen. Let's say I'm walking down the street, this pen belongs to somebody else who's not me, and off I go. Now, what have I done there? Now, what I think knee-jerk response from most of you will be, I've stolen some property that doesn't belong to me. And that is the knee-jerk response here. However, according to Becker, that's not what I've done. The first thing that I've done is an act. I have taken the pen. What you might have done, if you said I've stolen the pen, is you gave that act a label. And that is what Becker's labelling theory is all about. Deviant behaviour is behaviour people so label. Deviance is a social construct. It's made by the society that you're in. It's relative. varies from time to time and place to place. The label that you are given will affect your behaviour, and there are lots of negative labels. There are some positive ones as well. And everything starts with a behaviour. It starts with an act, which we then label after the fact. Okay? And that is what that quote means. And it's a very, very important one, because it, if you turn yourselves onto page 2, it kind of underpins all of the rest of Becker's theory. So, what Becker says, and I'm going to go through this very, very quickly here, and we're going to piece it together afterwards. Becker's book is called Outsiders, and he says once you're an outsider, you are treated as such. So the label will affect your behaviour, and the label will affect the way that people deal with you. They may potentially lead you onto a deviant career, and when he uses that term in the book Outsiders, Becker means like a life of crime, almost like a deviant pathway that you can never get out of. You're stuck on this deviant career, this deviant pathway of continual, maybe almost increasing levels of deviance. Within his labelling process, you can get a master status. Now, a master status is a status that overrides all your other statuses, a characteristic that everybody knows you by. You can look at this person here, Christian, dentist, footballer, job, husband, dad. So he's known by his role in the family, he's known by his role and his profession, he's known by his likes and his dislikes, he's known by his religious identity. But perhaps if he becomes an international drug lord, that is his master status. It does not matter that he's any of these other things, you can delete them all. What matters is he's got this criminal master status, the overriding characteristic which people think of him as. Now, this master status is very, very important, because you really can't associate with people who have a different master status from you if your master status is a negative one. Take, let's say, the homeless community in the town centre. If you go to a city centre, and you can generally pick a person who might be homeless. You judge them, you label them based on appearance, based on their behaviours, based on the act, right? And lots of people would say homeless is a master status, because when you look at a person, you go, that person is homeless. That is the master status that you know them by. And as such, they don't interact with you in the same way that they would if they didn't have that master status. And guess what? When you see them interacting with other people, generally, those other people that they will interact with have the same master status as them. So that is a very important characteristic. The last thing is something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, I'm going to ask you to click that video link at the bottom of the PowerPoint, which I will have attached, and watch this example of a self-fulfilling prophecy taking place. And a self-fulfilling prophecy is such where you internalize the label that you are given, and when you've internalized that label, you begin to act it out time and time and time again. So please watch the video there. It's a study into something called the Pygmalion effect, which is an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy by Rosenthal and Jacobson. Jacobson was a school principal, and Robert Rosenthal, who was a psychologist. Look at how the label, and in this case a positive label, not a negative one, but it can be a negative one as well, that the way that a label will affect your actions. So your actions towards other impact their belief about you, which cause you other actions and will reinforce your own belief. That's the process that we see going there. So watch that video, and as you are watching it, please make some notes here in the bottom regarding what happened and what you think of this self-fulfilling prophecy might mean. So in your own words, explain this self-fulfilling prophecy. Watch it, off you go. Right folks, so I'm hoping that you've seen the video, you've watched it, maybe it surprised you, maybe it's not. What you can certainly see taking place in the video is the power of the label, be it positive or be it negative, in this case positive. Literally, by the teacher having a different impression of their students, that affects the way the teacher interacts with those kids, and it affects their belief about themselves. You have 3 kids, at the front of the class. One of them is the designated bloomer, and in Rosenthal and Jacobson's study, it's completely at random. Then they're not somebody who's scientifically proven to be achieving in the year. It's completely random. You give back a grade CSA. Here's another grade CSA, and here you go, Timmy. You've got a C, but come on, Timmy, we can do better than that. Let's look where you went wrong. And immediately the teacher's then interacting more with this one child. Maybe when they're asking difficult questions, they'll look to that child and go, right, come on, what do you think? Maybe when they're, going round, that they might read out a good piece of his work because they go, right, let's inspire him, or this will be good. The other kids need to hear this. And then all of a sudden, little Timmy is starting to believe. He's starting to go, oh, maybe I am the smartest in the class. Maybe I should put my hand up a bit more. Maybe I will spend a bit more time on my homework. Maybe I will stay for the lunch club or whatever where I can practice my maths. And in Rosenthal and Jacobson's study, little Timmy and the other ones randomly assigned whose teachers were told they would bloom, ended up blooming because the teachers changed the way they interacted, changed their belief, and it led to them changing their own belief about themselves and becoming a more academically able student. Very fascinating study. But what you're thinking at the minute is you're going, Dan, you've talked to me about a master status, a deviant career, an act, a label, a self-fulfilling prophecy. How does this fit into Becker's theory? Well, on page number 3, you will see a flow diagram, and what we've got are 5 stages. You've got a self-fulfilling prophecy, a master status, an act, a deviant career, and the labelling of an act. What I want you to do is see if you can put this flow diagram into order. Now, you might not want to write it down on your page in case you're wrong, which is absolutely fine. A little bit of note paper, or think in your head, what is the order going to be for these 5 stages? Because logically, you go from A to Z, and that explains Becker's process. So, pause it now, give yourself a minute, think, what are these stages going to be? What's the order going to be for page number 3 in my book? Right, folks, so here is our labelling flow diagram. Individual commits an act. Obviously, remember, we put it on the board already. Everything begins with an act. It starts with an act. Okay? Then, that act has to be labelled. Take it, but that's an act of theft because I don't own the pen. So I've taken something that wouldn't belong to me, and thus that act gets labelled as theft. Think about it. Actually, if you walk past somebody's desk and you pinch a pen that is, I say pinch, that you take a pen that you gave to them earlier in that lesson, nobody accuses you of being a thief. Label's going to be different. So, commit an act. The act is taking something that doesn't belong to you. That act gets labelled. That act gets labelled as theft. Then, once you've got that label, you start to internalise it and act it out more. You steal another thing, you steal another thing, you steal another thing, and then everybody starts to recognise you have a master status. A main characteristic that everybody knows you by. It is thief. And that leads you onto a criminal career, because when you have that master status, you can only behave and talk to people of a similar status. You become isolated, like we said at the start, socially isolated from others. You can only hang about with people with the same master status, and then you are embarking on a deviant or criminal career, as Becker would call it. A deviant career path where you are on a life of crime. And that is Becker's labelling process, showing how doing one thing can lead you through your interactions and your own self-belief and the belief of people in you to ending up on a very unpleasant criminal journey. On page number 4, we are coming into the end. You will see that we are going to look at a particular study now of labelling in action. It's a study called The Saints and the Roughnecks, and it's by an American sociologist called William Chambliss. Now, Chambliss looks at high school and he looks at 2 different groups, Saints and the Roughnecks. What he's going to find is that one group, the Saints, and I wonder why he calls them that, were the middle class lads at school, and the Roughnecks, the very working class lads. Now, I'm going to post the PDF, which has got 2 kind of page-long explanations of what he thought about this group and what he thought about that group and where those groups end up. Okay? Your job is to do the Saints, the Roughnecks, and the bottom kind of little paragraph or little section here. You need to tell me what the Saints said, or what they were about, what the Roughnecks were about, and finally what the label was, and how that affected them in the long term. Okay? So look at that now, you've got to do the reading and you have to fill out that page, okay? That's what you need to do. Off you go. Alright, so Chambliss's study, as I'm sure you're now aware, and I'm not going to go into much detail because you've already read it, quite a sad one. You know, both of these groups, one thing that you need to remember is both these groups come into the education sector with the same kind of educational background and grades. So that they're not, one group is a lot more stupid than the other group. They're both similar levels of achievement, but because of the label that the Saints get, they can bunk out of class, they can leave early, they can have a good relationship and positive relationship with the teachers. Whereas these lads are the yobs, they're the thugs, the ones who've got the bad reputation. And as such, these end up professional jobs, doing well for themselves. These lads end up in working class jobs, end up in prison. The negative effects of the label are plain to see because the master status has clearly been given that these are the yobs, the thugs, versus these, the saintly, the good. And those labels will have an effect on how the teacher deals with them. And the long-term effect was a very different set of outcomes in terms of their life prospects and chances for those groups. Our final study that we are going to look at today, which is on page number 5 in your booklet, is a study by Daniel Briggs. Now there's a couple of fun quick videos here to watch based on a programme called Sons, Sex and Suspicious Parents, which you may or may not have watched, and they both show young people of your age or a little bit older, club 18 to 30, behaving quite badly abroad on holiday. This one shows a girl randomly just running into a wall. This one, a lad gets his arse out in the middle of like the bar, and then he gets a full fishbowl, glass fishbowl thrown at him and it shatters everywhere. These are the type of behaviours that have become accustomed for overseas resorts to see from British holidaymakers, and they were studied by Daniel Briggs in 2013. Now Briggs looks specifically at young people in Ibiza, so kind of like a party place, a bit of a clubbing capital, and what Briggs finds is that you lot, that's you people, are engaging in risky and criminal behaviour when you go abroad, when you go on these 18 to 30s holidays, when you go on these lads and lassies holidays. The behaviour you're engaging in is dangerous. It is stuff that you would never ever dream of doing here. But the label is affecting you because the resorts and the reps have placed the idea on you that you are British tourist, out on the lash, out looking to be risky, sexually promiscuous, criminal, damage, drunk, debauch, whatever you want to call it, and they play up to that. They expect that of you. They offer you booze cruises, they offer you all of the opportunities for games which are very, very dangerous and not going to be helpful at all. You know, drinking far too much and making very bad decisions because they expect that of the British holidaymaker. They've come prepped, they've given you a label, and guess what? You internalise that, and for your holiday you act out the label of, you know, risky, dangerous British tourist. And that's Daniel Briggs' study in 2013. So, ladies and gents, we come almost to the end of Interactionism, and obviously to finish it up, we've got to look at the strengths and the weaknesses. So, I'm going to give you the prompts now. I want you to pause it and I want you to think what the weaknesses of this theory are based off the prompts that I've given you. Number 1, the interactionist theory starts with a deviant act and moves on from there. What does it not explain if everything starts with an act? Number 2, it ignores some pretty important structural issues. What would a Marxist say? Let's look at that. Number 3, did you ever prove the teacher wrong? What does that tell us about labels that you can receive? And finally, number 4, think about the name of Becker's book for your answer to this one. What type of groups will it generally always focus on, which might be a bit of a negative? So pause it there. Don't necessarily fill them in, but you need to think about them. Can you finish any of those evaluation points? Okay, so let's go through them. Number 1, I hope you said this. Doesn't explain why people act in a deviant way to begin with. It's one of the reasons we've separated this from the other 4 social theories. The other 4 social theories give like youth culture a role because they say, oh, these subcultures exist to resist capitalism, or these exist to resist the patriarchy, or these This is youth culture, which is acting as a rite of passage, a transition from child to adult, or this is all about shaping my identity and buying and consuming the things that I want in a neo-tribe. Well, we haven't had any of that. This is separate. This is just kind of saying, this exists because, well, it starts with that and then you get the label. It doesn't explain a reason why anything's happened, which is why it's kind of separate from those other four theories. It means that when you assess the role, you almost can't give this a role because there's no reason for it. It's just this group have got a label and then they'll behave following that label. So that's a really important problem with this theory. Number two, you know what our Marxists would be saying, it's ignoring big issues like capitalism and class. It's very much, it's very much kind of focusing on just what the label is and not the kind of structural impact, just the small scale interactions. Number three, people can reject the labels that they have been given. It's almost deterministic in a sense that it says, just because you are this and you get this label, you have to act it out. You might have been somebody who's labelled at school, you might have been somebody who's been labelled in a group, and you might have chosen, oh, I'm not going to live up to the label of, underachiever or naughty kid. I'm just going to be positive all the time and I'm going to do well. Well, you can reject that label, and our interactionists don't say that that's possible, and they don't account for what happens and what type of person rejects a label. There's nothing about that. And then finally, we tend to focus on the lower. We tend to focus on the outsider. We never really look at the mainstream, because even if we study the high attainers, they're an outsider group. Even if we study the low, they're an outsider group. The dysfunctional, all of those will be the groups that interactionists focus on. However, a big positive of interactionism is when they do focus on these groups, they kind of use ethnography, which is a style which I'm sure you'll be familiar with from your lessons on research methods, of in-depth study, gaining qualitative data, gaining verstehen and those meanings and those motives, that deep understanding that we associate with interpretivists, we see linked fundamentally to the interactionist way of working. So that is it really for our lesson on interactionism. What I want you to do is make sure you've got the booklet complete and consolidate what you know, because now you're at a point where you've finished all of the theories when it comes to youth culture, and we're ready to move on to look at some of the topics.